Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
She looked stunning in white and colder than I'd ever seen her. My daughter. My only child. When she leaned in and whispered, "You're just the checkbook, not my dad," something in my chest didn't break, it just stopped. I stood there, frozen between laughter and collapse, my smile stitched in place while her stepfather adjusted his tie, ready to walk her down the aisle. The music swelled, people turned their heads, and I stayed perfectly still, as if moving would make the pain visible. That was months ago. Today, my phone won't stop ringing, 17 missed calls, each from her name, the same one that once appeared on macaroni Father's Day cards and late-night calls from college dorms. The last message she left said, "Please, I'm sorry. I haven't pressed play yet. Maybe I never will." But if you want to understand how it came to this, how love between a mother and daughter can freeze mid-sentence, you have to go back to where the silence began. It started slowly, the kind of slow that tricks you into thinking everything's fine. Back then, after Tom and I split, I told myself we'd handled the divorce like adults. No screaming, no custody battles, no throwing things across rooms. We divided the furniture, the mortgage, and even the dog. Sophie was 15 then, old enough to understand, too young to escape the fallout. She stayed with me during the week, him on weekends, though even in those early months I could feel him competing for her love like it was a prize to be won. Tom was always charming, the kind of man who could convince a storm to reschedule itself if it interfered with his golf plans. When he remarried Melissa, a perfectly put-together woman 10 years younger, I tried to be gracious. If she's good to Sophie, I told my sister, then that's all that matters. But there's a particular cruelty in watching someone else get credit for loving your child better. Melissa baked cookies for school events, remembered birthdays of Sophie's friends, threw backyard movie nights with fairy lights and those stupid Pinterest blankets that made everything look magical. And slowly, the texts from my daughter changed. First, they were long paragraphs about classes, friends, the weird kid in chemistry. Then they shrank, a few sentences, a single line, then nothing. I used to sit with my phone in hand, refreshing messages that wouldn't come, convincing myself she was just busy. Busy being a teenager, busy being happy, busy being someone else's daughter. Tom had a way of rewriting history without ever raising his voice. When Sophie mentioned her college plans, he told her, "Your mom's not exactly great with money. Don't expect much help there." I heard that line months later, secondhand, from my own daughter's lips. She said it gently, like she believed it, but didn't mean to hurt me. I remember smiling and saying, "Of course, honey. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out." I went home that night and opened my savings account. I had exactly enough for one semester if I stretched it tight. So I did. I skipped vacations, wore the same shoes to work for 3 years, and never told her about the second job I took on weekends. I didn't want her to see the struggle. I wanted her to see a mother who showed up no matter what. But presence means nothing when someone else is telling your story for you. By the time Sophie turned 18, she'd already begun using phrases that didn't sound like her. "Dad says you need to let go. Melissa thinks you're too emotional. You're always making things complicated." Each line felt like a signature on a document I'd never agreed to sign. The worst part wasn't the words, it was the tone. Detached, polite, the way you talk to a distant relative you see at funerals. I began to feel like an extra in my own life. I remember one night, sitting on the couch, looking through old photo albums. Sophie as a baby in the blue blanket I knit. Her missing front tooth, the summer she learned to swim. Her middle school graduation, where she hugged me so hard she nearly knocked me over. I stared at those photos until my eyes blurred, trying to understand where the warmth had gone. My sister told me to confront her, to ask what was happening, but I couldn't. I thought if I just kept loving her, it would fix itself. I believed that distance, like a bad dream, could be waited out. The truth is, distance doesn't grow in silence, it thrives in it. Every unanswered text, every postponed dinner, every "I'll call you later" became another brick in the wall between us. And I kept building it too, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending I was fine, pretending not to notice she called her father's house home. The night she moved in with Tom and Melissa permanently, she didn't even say goodbye. She just said, "It makes sense, Mom. They're closer to campus." I nodded and told her she was right. When the door closed, the quiet in the house felt like a physical thing, heavy, deliberate, final. Months later, she sent her first message since moving out. It was short. "Dad says you never wanted to help with my college. Is that true?" I stared at it for hours before replying. I typed, deleted, retyped, then finally sent. "I've been helping all along, sweetheart. You just didn't see it." She never responded. I sat up all night, wondering if she'd read it, wondering if she'd ever know how many corners I'd cut to make sure she never felt abandoned. That was the night I realized I wasn't losing her, I already had. Love doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It fades like an echo in a long hallway until all you can hear is yourself breathing. Still, I held on to hope. Because that's what mothers do. They keep loving, even when it's no longer returned. And I would have kept doing it forever if not for that phone call a year later, the one that came out of nowhere, with her voice trembling but composed, asking, "Mom, Dad says you'll cover the wedding costs, right?" When Sophie told me she was moving in with her father and Melissa, she made it sound like a practical decision, the kind adults make without sentiment. She said the drive from my apartment to campus was too long, that her dad's house was closer, that Melissa had turned the guest room into something that looked like a Pinterest board come to life. She spoke in a tone that was perfectly reasonable, like she was describing a math problem, not choosing sides. I nodded and smiled, because what else was there to do? You can't force someone to stay where they've already left emotionally. And the truth is, by the time she carried that last box out of my apartment, she wasn't leaving home. She was simply taking the final step in a process that had already happened quietly, months before. The first few weeks were polite. She called sometimes, mostly on Sundays, her voice bright but distant, as though she were speaking from another world. I told myself it was fine. I told myself every parent goes through this when their child grows up. But deep down, I could feel something shifting. When she posted photos online, I'd see her standing beside Tom and Melissa, the three of them dressed like they'd coordinated wardrobes, smiling in that polished way families do for Christmas cards. She looked radiant, happy, even, and I wanted to be happy for her. I really did. But the captions told a different story. "So thankful for my bonus mom. Family means everything. Couldn't do life without you." I'd stare at those words like they were written in a foreign language, trying to translate what they meant for me. Was I still part of that everything? I sent small gifts, little things I knew she liked, candles, scarves, a book she'd once said she wanted to read. Sometimes I added a card, signing it simply "Love, Mom," hoping to remind her that love didn't disappear just because the address changed. The packages were delivered. The silence that followed was louder than any thank you could have been. Once, after 3 weeks with no response, I called and asked if she'd gotten the parcel. She said, "Oh yeah, thanks." Melissa loved the wrapping paper, then changed the subject to her father's new car. That was when I started to understand that I had become background noise in my own daughter's life. Still present, still necessary, but easy to tune out. The following Thanksgiving, Tom sent me a text, short and infuriatingly polite. "Sophie will be spending the holiday here this year. We think it's best she keeps things simple." I sat with that message for a long time, rereading the word "we." It wasn't just Tom deciding anymore. It was we, him, and Melissa. They were a team now, shaping her world, rewriting the story I used to live in. I told myself it was temporary, that kids always circle back when the world stops spinning as fast. But when the photos from that Thanksgiving appeared online, a perfect dinner table, golden light, wine glasses, and laughter, I knew she wasn't coming back anytime soon. A few weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. It wasn't from Sophie. It was from a bridal boutique. Invoice enclosed, it read, "For dress payment in full." No note, no call, just an invoice. My name was written neatly in the payer section, my daughter's in bride. I remember holding that piece of paper and laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was absurdly predictable. Of course, she'd expect me to pay. I always did. I always had. It was easier to sign checks than to start fights, and maybe, in some twisted way, I thought my money could buy me a place at her table again. So I paid it. Quietly. Without complaint. A week later, I got a message from her that said, "Thank you, Mom. You're the best. We took family engagement photos today. You'll love them." I clicked the link she sent, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. There she was, in a soft pink dress, standing between Tom and Melissa, holding their hands. They looked like a trio out of an advertisement for perfect families, happy, symmetrical, complete. My daughter's smile didn't falter, not once. I scrolled through each picture, waiting for one that included me, even in mention, even in a caption. There wasn't. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, thinking about how easily people can be replaced when someone else offers a shinier version of love. But what cut deepest wasn't that she'd chosen them, it was that she'd started to believe the version of me they'd created. The overly emotional, difficult, ungrateful woman who never understood her daughter's world. I wondered how many small conversations it took for that version of me to feel real in her mind. And yet, I didn't confront her. I didn't scream, didn't demand an explanation. I told myself love means giving space, even when it feels like suffocating. I kept wiring money when she needed it, signing forms when she asked, staying invisible because that's what she seemed to want. Each transaction felt like a fragile bridge between us, a way to stay relevant in a story that no longer had room for me. Then one evening, nearly a year after she'd moved out, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another charity call or a wrong number. But it was Sophie, her voice unusually soft, like she was rehearsing kindness. She said she had good news, she was getting married. Before I could even react, she added, "Dad says you'll cover the wedding costs, right? You've always been so generous." I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I just listened to the faint echo of my own heartbeat as she talked about venues and floral arrangements, her voice bright with excitement, unbothered by what she was asking. When she hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the quiet room around me, realizing that maybe she wasn't calling her mother at all. Maybe she was calling her checkbook. The wedding invitation didn't arrive in my daughter's handwriting or even with her perfume on the envelope the way she used to send notes in high school when she wanted permission to come home late. It arrived from Melissa, typed and efficient and emotionally sterile. Addressed to me as if I were a vendor rather than a mother, with a neat line that read, "For financial coordination," and a bullet point list of expectations that included venue balance dates, florist upgrades, a photography add-on. For drone footage that made me laugh out loud because nothing says eternal love like a buzzing gadget over your vows, and a seating chart that put me at a back table near the catering door, which I noticed not because I am fussy about chairs, but because the diagram literally labeled my spot Mom, Pair. I set the card down and stared at the kitchen clock in that slow, stupefied way grief makes time heavy, and then I poured coffee I didn't want and reread the list, admitting to myself that there is a particular humiliation in financing a celebration that has been engineered to display how unnecessary you are, a sort of theater of replacement where your role is to clap quietly, smile in the right moments, and keep your checkbook open like a tip jar. I called Sophie and, to my mild surprise, she answered quickly with the breathless cheerfulness people use when they're about to ask for something large, but want you to feel lucky to be chosen. She talked about bridesmaid dresses like pale rain, a cake with 4 tiers and sugared flowers, and a string quartet that would make even Tom look romantic, and I listened without interrupting because I needed to hear whether my daughter would say the sentence I'd been waiting for, the one that begins with "Mom, I want you there with me," but she didn't, not once, and when I asked about the invitation coming from Melissa she said, "She's just organized, Mom, it's easier this way," which in my head translated to, "She's running the show." And perhaps it was easier that way, easier not to think about what is owed and what is loved. I told her calmly that I would help, that I always had, that I always would, but that there needed to be order so no vendor ended up unpaid or confused. And I said it in a tone so reasonable that even I believed the fiction that this was logistics rather than self-preservation. Then I asked for the contracts to be sent to me directly and suggested we shift from personal reimbursements to vendor payments, which sounds boring unless you have ever stood in a storm and realized the only umbrella left is the one you sew yourself. Within an hour, my inbox filled with proposals and balances and a photographer's packet with rights and delivery terms, and I read every line like it was a foreign treaty, adding one clause that any final deliverables, raw files, gallery links, video masters, would be released upon final payment by the primary signer, which happened to be me, a detail no one questioned because no one ever reads the clauses they assume a mother signs out of softness. I drove to the venue that week because if I was going to fund a celebration that pushed me to the outer rim, I at least wanted to look the center in the eye. And I met a coordinator who wore a headset and the smile of someone who has seen every flavor of family war dressed up as etiquette, and I told her I'd be paying deposits directly and that any add-ons would require my written approval. Not because I wanted control over the color of the napkins, but because I wanted a record that I existed. That my name sat somewhere other than the last page next to a signature that could be ignored, and she nodded with that sympathetic tilt professionals reserve for people who are both footing the bill and swallowing their pride. Then she walked me through the ballroom where I tried not to imagine how it would feel to watch my daughter be escorted by someone else while I participated as the quiet financier of my own erasure. At night, I sharpened my kindness into something usable, replying to Melissa's bullet points with slightly longer sentences that were polite yet edged, clarifying that drone footage was out, that the florist upgrade could stay if she removed the ridiculous rose wall that looked like an apology you had to stand in front of, that the quartet would play but only if they provided a playlist in advance, because I refused to bankroll our song selections that cut me from every memory. I signed checks that felt like tribute payments to a kingdom that had exiled me, and I numbered them all, kept copies, and sent payments with a calm note that said, "Balance will be remitted upon receipt of final deliverables," which was the closest thing to a boundary I could hold without starting a war. Friends told me not to go at all, to let them see what a wedding looks like without the woman they'd demoted to a purse, but I couldn't do it, because I remembered the girl who used to leave sticky notes on my steering wheel that said, "Love you more." And I thought maybe if I stood in the room, even at the back by the kitchen door, she would look up and see the place where we began. So I bought a simple dress that didn't compete with anyone's fantasies, had it altered on a Tuesday night by a seamstress who told me, without knowing me, that mothers never forget the weight of the first pair of tiny shoes, and I laughed in that dangerous way that keeps crying from happening in public. On the day I sent the last deposit, I paused, not out of doubt but out of something like grim ceremony, and I attached a one-line memo to the photographer's invoice. Final gallery release requires approval of primary signer. A sentence so unremarkable it looked like paperwork, and yet it felt like a small, private promise to myself that there would be at least one thing in this entire production that could not be taken without my yes. And maybe that is not revenge in the cinematic sense, but for a woman who has been recast as a wallet, it was the only dignified move left that didn't slash the tires on the whole event. The envelope with my invitation arrived 2 weeks later, and tucked behind the RSVP card was a seating diagram that labeled my table relatives, which is a hilarious word to apply to the person who taught the bride to walk. And as I slid the card back into its sleeve, my phone buzzed with a message from Sophie, a casual little line that pretended it wasn't a knife, saying, "Quick update, Dad thinks it'll be better if he walks me down the aisle." The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of bright, indifferent sunlight that makes everything look clean even when it isn't, and I dressed with a slowness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with caution, because if I rushed I might start thinking. And if I started thinking I might not go at all, so I zipped the understated dress, fixed the clasp on a necklace Sophie made in middle school from inexpensive beads and stubborn pride, and I drove to the venue while practicing the only line I allowed myself to speak out loud, the safe, neutral sentence that fits any weather: "You look beautiful." I parked farther than necessary, walked past trucks unloading flowers and chairs, nodded at a caterer who asked for directions I didn't have, and found my table by the kitchen door exactly where the diagram said I'd be. which felt less like a mistake and more like a design that had finally arrived at its final, logical shape. I remember thinking that a ballroom is designed for performance, that the stage doesn't end at the arch, but extends to the moment you choose a smile and pin it to your face, and I pinned mine tightly, because I wanted no one to remember me for tears. And when Tom came by with a cologne that smelled like an expensive alibi, he said I looked well, and I told him he looked consistent, which made him laugh in that thin way he laughs when he knows there's a sentence hidden inside the sentence and he hopes you won't unwrap it. Melissa floated after him like a coordinated accessory, thanked me effusively for being so supportive, and spoke about the timeline with a crispness that belonged on an event board, not a family, and I said, of course, absolutely, yes. Because there are days you wield politeness like a shield, and this was one of them. When the ceremony music began, a string arrangement that was pretty enough to make you forgive how overused it was, the entire room turned toward the aisle, a small choreography everyone knows by instinct. And I saw Sophie in the doorway with her face shining and her shoulders back in that way she has when she is determined to look like everything is fine. And for a suspended instant I thought she would glance in my direction the way she used to check for me during school recitals, that tiny flicker of eye contact that says we are still connected even when we are not speaking, but she did not look at me. She looked at Tom, and the photographer lifted a camera like a blessing. And before they stepped forward, she crossed the few steps to where I stood just inside the row, leaned close enough for me to smell the sugar of her lipstick, and said, almost tenderly, as if she believed gentleness would soften the blow, that I was just the checkbook, not her dad. There are words that detonate loudly and leave smoke, and there are words that slice quietly and leave everything standing while the foundation cracks, and hers were the second kind, so I nodded as if she had reminded me of the time or the place cards. And I said the line I had practiced until it lost all meaning, you look beautiful, and I smoothed a wrinkle in my own skirt as if I were fixing a detail for her. Then I stepped back to let the aisle belong to them, because I will not compete for a spotlight that requires me to beg, and I watched her walk away holding an arm that was not mine, and I clapped at the right moments like a good extra, and I breathed in counts of 10 so the room would stay in focus. After the vows and the applause and the free-frame photographs that will one day confuse a grandchild who wonders why the woman by the kitchen door isn't in any of the albums, the party swelled into that pleasant chaos of speeches and naps and drinks that try to be stronger than regret, and I floated from table to table with a polite gravity, listening more than speaking, signing a few vendor slips because someone had lost a pen. And when the photographer came to confirm the evening schedule, I thanked her for the timeline and, with a steadiness that surprised even me, I reminded her of the clause attached to the final gallery release, the one that said the primary signer approves delivery. And I asked for a small administrative update that sounded as harmless as a comma, adding my personal email as the first point of contact for the gallery link and the master video, which she typed in front of me with quick fingers and a cheerful nod, unaware that she was tightening a knot I had placed weeks ago for exactly this moment. I did not make a scene. I did not pull a plug mid-dance. I did not humiliate a bride who had already chosen her theater. Instead, during the first dance, while the room watched two people orbit their own version of forever, I sent a set of quiet messages from the hallway, each written in that immaculate customer service tone I have sharpened over a lifetime of being reasonable, one to the bank to remove my secondary card from an account she had forgotten I could see, one to the utility autopay I had been covering for an apartment she no longer lived in but somehow still cost me every month, one to the planner confirming that all balances were paid in full and that any future expenditures would require a new contract, and one final note to the photographer, thanking her for her work and reiterating that gallery approval would come from me alone after review, which constituted neither a threat nor a disruption, but a boundary so clean you could set a glass on it. When I returned to the ballroom, I slipped a generous tip to the catering captain with a whisper that she keep her staff hydrated and fed, because the best revenge is always to be the kindest person in the room to those who actually labor. And I sat at my designated place by the door with a plate of food that tasted like nothing and everything at once, and I stayed to the last toast, because leaving early would have given them a story I didn't know them, and when the lights finally softened and the Room began to unbutton itself. I hugged my daughter gently, told her once more that she looked beautiful, and walked out into the cool night with my shoulders square and my heart beating in that slow, painful way a muscle beats when it has been tested and did not fail. I went home, washed off the careful face, opened my laptop at the kitchen table that has raised more meals than memories lately, and with hands that did not shake I closed the last shared account she was still attached to, archived the payment confirmation so there would be no confusion later, and placed my phone face down so the silence could stretch until it was finally mine, and if there was revenge in any of it, it lived in the fact that everything continued to function without me except the parts that required my consent, which would matter soon enough, because months later, after the petals browned, after the honeymoon filters dulled, after the bills arrived with their plain insistence, my phone lit up with a string of messages from the same daughter who had said I was a wallet, and the first 3 words, cracked open by reality, were "Please, I'm sorry." By the time the leaves crisped and the glitter from that ballroom had settled into the bottom of people's closets, the quiet I had cultivated like a winter garden was finally starting to feel like mine. A room with clean air and plenty of light where no one's opinions arrived uninvited, yet that morning the phone on my kitchen counter began to pulse with the stubborn rhythm of a door someone refuses to stop knocking. And when I turned it over I saw my daughter's name stacked again and again. With the same blunt preface, missed call, followed by a row of voicemails that the screen summarized with those hungry little ellipses, and a string of texts that began with "please" and ended, many lines later, with "I'm sorry," which I understood not as surrender, but as the first honest sentence she had sent me in years. I made coffee I didn't need, sat down, and pressed play on the first message, bracing for manipulation and barbs wrapped in sugar. Yet what came through the speaker was the sound of someone trying to breathe through water, while she told a story that would have sounded like gossip if it were not also her life. Because apparently the new husband's company had folded with the kind of speed that leaves the fridge full and the accounts empty, the landlord had issued a notice that did not care how long the honeymoon glow lasts, and the charming stepfamily had begun to show the cracks it always hides while photographers are present, with Melissa hedging her generosity into that brittle form of kindness that is indistinguishable from a performance review, and Tom dodging calls with the grace of a man who believes consequences are for other people. And by the 3rd voicemail the tone shifted from embarrassment to something like dawning clarity as she said, in a voice that was as small as the day I taught her to ride a bike, that she thought maybe she had been wrong about some things, that maybe she had believed stories told by people with motives, and that she needed to talk to me, not because of money though, she admitted, everything right now is about money, but because she suddenly missed the way my kitchen smells like lemons on Sundays and the way I listen without jumping in to fix what cannot be fixed with tape and a check. I listened to each message in order, not skipping even when she repeated herself or when a sob cut a sentence into ragged halves, and by the time I reached the 17th I knew that the question wasn't whether she wanted help. It was whether I would offer the same kind of help I had before, the invisible kind that lets other people take bows, or whether I would finally give the only help that ever changes anything, which is the kind with terms attached that sound, at first, like punishment but are in truth a map. So I opened my laptop, pulled up the wedding contracts, and saw the tidy confirmation I had been expecting, the one from the photographer who had been waiting for primary signer approval to release the full gallery and the master video. Those glossy artifacts that families use to prove to themselves that a single beautiful day can anchor a messy life, and I realized that while I had no interest in dangling souvenirs like a ransom, I did have the right to decide when and how that picture book entered circulation, and what conditions would accompany it. I called the photographer first and thanked her for her patience, then I approved a small advance set, 10 images, carefully chosen, unwatermarked, delivered to my daughter's private email with a note that said simply for your home. Because even in the middle of a reckoning I will not rob her of the right to place beauty on a wall, while I scheduled the full release for a later date, and then, with that done, I sat down to write the longest text I have ever sent, a message that avoided the soft traps of nostalgia and the hard edge of "I told you so," and instead laid out a handful of clear, human terms written as if they were promises I was making to myself as much as to her, that we should meet in person, just the two of us, on the bench by the river where she used to feed ducks with stale bread and dreams, that before we talk about a single bill we will agree on therapy with a neutral counselor so our apologies do not turn into courtroom statements, that I will not be financing rescue missions woven out of silence anymore, but I will invest in plans that include her own name on every account and her signature on every responsibility, that love is not a credit line and forgiveness is not a cashier, and that if she wants me back in her life it will be as her mother, not as an emergency fund with a pulse. I read the draft twice, deleted a line that sounded theatrical, added one small kindness, "You were a beautiful bride," that has always been true, and sent it before my courage could rust. Then I turned the phone face down and stood at the sink with the same necklace on that I had worn to her wedding, feeling the steady weight of the beads against my throat like an old truth I had finally stopped arguing with. And when the reply arrived, it did not explode the room or fix history in one burst. It simply said yes and named a time, and asked if I wanted coffee from that place we used to go after school, which told me more than any apology could have. I will not pretend the messages changed everything overnight, because nothing worth repairing heals in a montage, and I am not naive enough to believe that someone who once replaced me with a story will never be tempted by a different story again. Still, as I walked to the river later that week with the wind tugging at my sleeves and the sky doing its tentative spring impression in late fall, I felt the strange, careful hope you only get once you have survived the worst version of your own expectations, and I carried in my bag an envelope with 2 of the approved photographs printed in quiet black and white, not as leverage but as an offering, along with a simple contract I wrote for myself that said love continues, credit closes, and boundaries are not walls, but doorways with locks. Whether we walk through together is not a guarantee I can stamp with a pen or annotate like a vendor clause, and perhaps that uncertainty is the only honest ending a story like this deserves, so I kept the gallery in reserve. I kept my heart open but not unguarded, and while the river moved the way rivers always move forward, unbothered by the debris they carry, I waited to see whether my daughter would arrive as a woman ready to build something worth living in, or as a girl asking for another. Check, and I decided that, either way, my silence would no longer be the room where other people rehearsed their lines, because I finally had my own voice, and it was strong enough to say yes on my terms and no without apology.